Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. Today I have two cards to share with you using stencils, ink blending, and clear texture paste. When I was working on coming up with ideas for this video, I couldn't decide if I wanted to do a fall themed card or a Christmas themed card, so I decided why not do one of each. So I'm going to be using the same exact technique for these two different cards. One of them is going to be more of a Thanksgiving card, and one's going to be a Christmas card. Starting out with my autumn-themed card, I first picked out a stencil. I decided to go with this one from Simon Says Stamp called Tumbling Leaves. For my paper, I decided to use Bristol smooth paper, so I cut a nice large square of that, just a little bit bigger than my stencil, and then I taped the stencil and the paper down onto a wooden board. And I just used painter's tape to tape that all down. As for the inks that I'm using for my ink blending, I decided to use Distress Oxide inks, and I wanted it to be really colorful. So I picked out what I would call an autumn rainbow of colors. It's definitely not a traditional rainbow because I did mix things up a little bit and there's not a lot of blue, but I do think it really works for the autumn look that I was going for. If you want to know the colors that I used, from the bottom left side going to the top right side, I used ripe persimmon, seedless preserves, candied apple, mustard seed, mowed lawn, and pine needles. When the ink blending was done, I left the stencil in place. I didn't move anything, and I grabbed this transparent gloss texture paste from Ranger, and I'm going to spread that as evenly as I can across the surface of the stencil using a palette knife. Something to keep in mind while doing this is that the Distress Oxide ink that's sitting on the surface of the stencil is going to blend with your texture paste, and it's going to dye that texture paste. You can see this really clearly here when I wipe off my palette knife on the paper towel. All of that texture paste is a completely different color because it has picked up all of that Distress Oxide ink. So because of this, you want to make sure that you don't mix your colors together where they're not going to look good. For example, if you go over the area with the red, don't immediately go over the area with the green until you wipe off your palette knife so that you don't contaminate those two colors together. Once all that texture paste is nice and smoothed out evenly, you very carefully remove the tape from the stencil and then lift that stencil up while the texture paste is still wet. It's very important to do this while the texture paste is still wet, and then you want to immediately clean your stencil. And I just like to use warm water to clean the texture paste off of my stencil. With the first background done, I set it aside to dry and I moved on to my second background. This one I picked out the Mod Trees stencil from Simon Says Stamp, and I set it up just like I did the first one on Bristol smooth paper, taped down onto a wooden board. For this one, I went with just 4 different colors of Distress Oxide ink. From the top to the bottom, I have mustard seed, mowed lawn, pine needles, and chipped sapphire. To get a nice blend with my Distress Oxide inks, I like to go back and forth between the two colors that I'm blending together until I get a nice smooth transition. Again, just like with the first background, I then moved on to adding the texture paste. Like I mentioned before, the texture paste is going to get a little bit dyed by the Distress Oxide ink, so I would recommend wiping off the palette knife often on a paper towel, especially when you're going to go back into the jar for more texture paste. It's really important to wipe it off before you do that so that you don't contaminate the whole jar. Once both of these backgrounds were done, I set them aside to dry overnight. You do want to give the texture paste a decent amount of time to dry. I also like to make sure to put them in a good place for drying. I find that if you leave them in a place where they could get dust on them or pet hair, you might be sad to find that there is a cat hair in your dry texture paste later on. For the sentiments on both of these cards, I decided to cut out some big strips of vellum and then emboss my sentiments onto those strips with white embossing powder. I prepped both of the pieces of vellum with a powder bag before stamping so that I didn't have to worry about the embossing powder sticking anywhere where I didn't want it to. And then I stamped both of the sentiments with Versamark ink and embossed them. Now, vellum does have a tendency to warp pretty easily when you're embossing, so in order to try and avoid that as much as possible, I turned my heat tool on and I let it heat up for quite a while so that it was nice and hot. Then when I actually started using it on the vellum, I only had the heat tool on the vellum for short bursts of time. Moving on to the next day, when both of my backgrounds were completely dry, I first used my paper trimmer to cut them down to size, and I decided to cut them both down to 5.5 by 5.5. In the end, both of my cards are going to be 6x6 cards. I created the card bases for my cards off camera, and I used Bristol smooth paper to create them because they are such large cards. Normally for card bases, I like to use my Nina paper, but because they are 6x6 card bases, I needed a slightly bigger paper size, so that's why I went with the Bristol smooth paper. Right here you can see that vellum sentiment that I made earlier. Now I'm going to be wrapping this around my background so that I could hide the adhesive. So I first lined it up where I wanted it on the card and made some pencil marks so that I know where to fold it. And then for my first fold, I used my Score Buddy just so that I could get a nice straight fold. Once I have that first fold nice and straight, I can put it on the background and very easily fold the other side around the back. I actually just used some regular Scotch tape to hold these in place, and then later when I put them onto my card base, I'm going to be using some foam tape and that will hold them in place even more. I did exactly the same thing with the other vellum sentiment, but for this one, instead of putting it across horizontally onto the background, I'm going to put it vertically. When I made this first score mark, I realized that my pencil mark was going to be visible from the front of the card, so I just grabbed an eraser and I erased that real quick. Solves that problem nice and easily, and then I folded across that score mark. I really wanted to keep the sentiments for both of these cards pretty simple so that my backgrounds could really stand out and be the stars of the cards. And I really love how using the vellum allows you to see the background through it so that you can still see as much of that background as possible. Okay, so like I mentioned, I created my card bases off camera and I added some colored cardstock to the front of each of those card bases. For this first one, I added a piece of midnight green cardstock from Simon Says Stamp to the front of the card base, and then I popped up my background with some foam tape right on top of that cardstock. For this second card, I cut a 6x6 piece of vintage timber cardstock from My Favorite Things, adhered that to the front of my card base, and then I popped up the background onto that. Not only does that foam tape give some nice dimension to the card, it also helps to straighten out any warping that might have happened from the texture paste. I didn't want to add a lot of embellishments to these cards because, like I said, I wanted my backgrounds to be the statement and the focal point of these cards, so I just added some clear sequins using some liquid adhesive. After that, both of these cards are done, and here you can see all of the shine on that background from that gloss texture paste. Honestly, photos don't really do these cards justice. They're kind of hard to photograph. You really gotta try it in real life. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed both of these card designs and that they gave you some ideas and inspiration. I hope that you'll try out some ink blending and texture paste techniques. They are really fun. I know it does take a little bit of time to dry the texture paste, but it's really worth it in the end. If you're interested in any of the products that I used on this card, I do have them listed in the description down below. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next time.